obviously a couple of years ago, when I did more research on epigenetics, I became very interested in epigenetics because we know that nowadays genes are, obviously they are very important, and but they are not everything. So they don't determine our destiny.
The crowd anticipating something special once again. Oh, it's a tough act to follow, but he's done it again.
Excellence can be created, it can be replicated, it can be taught.
Boom. So welcome onto the Inner Game podcast, Dr. Marayam Sadraie. Thank you very much for coming onto the show today. Obviously, the podcast is called the Inner Game podcast, looking at the psychological, mental and emotional factors influencing performance. But even in spite of my background and knowledge about the mind and psychology, I'm fully aware that there is no separation between mind and body. The mind and body are linked. There is a continual looping symbiosis, in my opinion, of brain and body. And I think for me, one of the things that many athletes get caught up in is that their performance is all about the body and not the mind. But I'm really excited to have you on the show today to talk more about the body and then delve into the world of genetics and epigenetics and how that can affect we as people generally, our general health and mental health, but also how genetics and epigenetics can influence and affect athletic performance. So thank you very much for coming on to the show, Marayam.
Thank you very much, Rob, for having me. I'm very excited to talk about the importance of gene and epigenetics on athletic performance.
Me too. So if you could, for myself and the others, Marayam, could you give us a background as to your training in the medical world, how your kind of fascination with genes and genetics and epigenetics? First of all, where did it begin? I.e., when you was deciding to go to medical school, perhaps, what was it that was narrowing your focus? I want to start looking into this area as opposed to all these other areas. How did your journey into where you have got to start?
Yeah, I always was very fascinated with patterns of inheritance. That is why I decided to study genetics at university. And so my journey started by going to Queen Mary University of London, and I did my medical genetics there. I think it was around 2006, 2007, it was ages ago. And I did medical genetics. It was my first degree. And then I became very interested. I always was interested in patterns of inheritance and regarding the chromosomes and how we can inherit loads of characteristics from the parents. And so my main training during my master degree and my PhD degree was mainly, I was a cytologist. I was working, studying the chromosomes, and I worked on Down syndrome for a while. And then I work in the field of reproduction, and I look at the genetic point of infertility and miscarriages. And then I was a researcher for a while, and then I left research and I became I was very involved in teaching after that. So I was very interested always in science communication. That's why I decided to just go in teaching field mainly, and because still we need more science communicator in the field of genetics. There are lots of misconceptions, and we need more experts to be able to explain everything in a very simple way, and to make the understand the public regarding those misconceptions, and obviously the very complicated genetics, discussion. So yeah, that was my journey, and I'm always quite nowadays because of epigenetics, as I just obviously a couple of years ago when I did more research on epigenetics, I became very interested in epigenetics, because we know that nowadays genes are obviously they are very important, and but they are not everything, so they don't determine our destiny. So epigenetics play an essential role, and we have a huge control in our destiny. It's not our genes are decide to whether we are going to get a specific disease or not in future, but we can do something to prevent it. That is a really just good sign, optimistic regarding to prevent diseases, like for example cancer or lots of diseases like type 2 diabetes. So we can to have more control on our destiny, and so that is why epigenetics is really, really important nowadays. And hopefully because of epigenetics we can see that people they are talking about better lifestyle choices, better diet, and so these are all, I think, have a great impact on our health, and especially in some diseases like nowadays cancer, as we were discussing before. Regarding cancer, less than 2% of all cancers are genetics, so it's mainly epigenetics. That is why I was very fascinated about epigenetics as well.
So as I was mentioning off air, Marayam, I have looked into genetics and epigenetics myself, because of my, as I say, my fascination for trying to understand human performance, and more importantly, sporting performance. And I'd always had in my mind this wanting to understand nature versus nurture. What is the biggest driver, if there is one? Is one impacting more the other, or is it simply an equal interplay of both? And myself and some of my friends, one of them in particular, he was massively on the nature side. We would have a lot of like heated debates about this. He was adamant, you're born this way. What you're born with is far more important than anything else. And that just never rang true to me. It didn't. And it was, if I'm honest, it was a TV show that was on the BBC with this professor from the King's College called Tim Spector. He did this documentary, and I thought, right, somebody's looking into this. And I bought his book, as I mentioned, Identically Different, which was basically an amalgamation of however many years worth of research on twins, which was looking at why is it if two twins with the exact same set of genes, how do they end up different? If they have the exact same genes and our genes are controlling where our life is going, then the genes that you're given with at birth and when you come out into this world, they should still be the same during and at the end, and therefore they should be the same. And his research time and time and time again kept showing that they turned out different. And that within his book, that was when he kind of alerted me to this world of epigenetics. And I can't remember the exact phrase or term. It's gone from my mind, but essentially how I understood it is that within our genes there's like an on and an off switch that our environment
turns it on or off, like that light switch. If I turn the lights off now, the lights are there, but if I flick the switch off, it's not being used or activated. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that specifically, if possible.
Yes, of course. As you said, yes, nature versus nurture was a very controversial topic. I completely understand. And but when we're talking about the main question is whether there is any relationship between nature and nurture or not, and which one is stronger. We had the same issue, for example, with intelligence. So some people think it's definitely is genetics, and some people are strongly believe that environment had a great impact on it. So the main thing is our genes are influenced by our environment as well, but it doesn't mean the genes, because when we're talking about epigenetics in public, some people believe that maybe our genes are modified and or changing. So, but they are not changing, because when we're talking about the epigenetics, as we said, we're talking mainly about how genes are expressed, because it doesn't really, the sequence of DNA is not changed, but how our genes are expressed will be changed. It depends on our lifestyle choices. It depends on stress, lack of sleep, diet, exercise. All of these things has a very great impact on our gene expression and how genes are expressed, how they are interacting with the environment. So as you said, gene expression means, or the regulation of genes, very important in this case. So it means whenever genes are constantly on and off, because we have the same DNA sequence in for example, in each cell of our, brain. For example, in the brain cell, if you compare your brain cell and a heart cell, in the nucleus of each, we have got exactly the same DNA, same gene. But the question is why our heart function is completely different from brain, because the genes are responsible for your heart function are on in your heart cells, but in your brain cells, those genes are off, because brain cell has got completely different function and those genes are not required. So that is this is how the genes are always on and off, and how they interact with the environment. This is called epigenetics.
So, does every human do we all have the same genes? And it's just, is it therefore then which genes are being expressed and turned on and off that is the issue? Or do we have different genes?
Yeah, we have all of us, we have slightly different genes. So if you look at the DNA sequence, if I sequence my DNA and you sequence yours, mostly our DNA sequence is similar, but we have got some slightly different sequences as well. So yeah, it doesn't mean we have all the same genes, all of us. There are some differences.
Yeah. So one of the things that really I found this world of epigenetics, and there's another man that I've read, he's done a few books, and he was one of the early pioneers into epigenetics. He's an American professor, I think he was at Stanford or Harvard University, I can't remember which one, called Dr. Bruce Lipton. And he wrote a book called The Biology of Belief, which is a very popular book. And essentially, it's looking into the impact of, we almost have two environments, our internal environment within our body and the external environment. So if our beliefs, like a placebo, they can act like a placebo, hence the placebo pill, and the placebo studies that they do. And part of his book is looking about how our beliefs, which depending on what we believe is true or not true, or what is possible or not is possible, that internal belief that one may have can therefore also affect their internal environment. For example, somebody may find walking up to the top of Eiffel Tower petrifying. they believe that they're scared of heights, that they believe that being that height up is dangerous and a threat to them. That would therefore affect their internal environment, wouldn't it? That their levels of adrenaline would go up, the cortisol hormones would go up, their internal environment would change. And what he referred to in his book was how, the repeated bouts of stress, for example, which could be brought on when people's having long-term bouts of mental health issues, anxiety, stress, depression, persistently over days and weeks and months and years. Ultimately, therefore, it's possible that increased bouts of stress and anxiety internally could then start to affect how our genes are expressed. Would you say that that's something that you would be aligned with that kind of statement there?
Yes, our stress level or anxiety, as you said, they can have impact on our gene expression. And so therefore they can, because obviously they all impact on our brain, and specific, as you said, the specific hormones are become more, obviously they express more. And so this is the main cause of all these mental health issue we get sometimes. So they can, and this is because there are can be environmental factor. They impact on some of our gene expression. And so therefore they can cause some issue, which is not genetics, but is environmental and is mainly epigenetics. But they might, for example, turn on unnecessary genes, and those genes can cause some issues for us. But I'm not sure that's been how the way we are thinking, our beliefs, does it impact on it? Is very, very controversial, and it's not really exactly my field to discuss that. But I strongly believe that probably when we're talking about belief, maybe as you mentioned, for example, the amount of the stress we get, for example, our stress level or anxiety or these kind of things, or for example, lack of sleep, maybe they can count as environmental factor, which they can cause. Also, we call them, it's kind of epigenetics factor and impact on the expression of some of our genes.
Yeah, and you mentioned earlier about cancer and how, I think for a long time, many people, scientists, doctors, the medical world, and then the general public believe, that C word, the cancer word, was almost like a death sentence, if you like, and if there was family history of that, then some people were feeling that, well, my dad, my granddad, etc., they died or they had it, and therefore I'm going to get it. However, this research, these new understandings about epigenetics, how I see it is that kind of disproves that theory in many respects, in that it doesn't have to be that way. How I see it, again, correct me if I'm wrong, is that if how our parents and grandparents potentially lived their lives. For example, if my dad and my granddad, for example, were overweight, obese, did very little exercise, had very poor nutrition, they maybe smoked a lot, they maybe drank a lot, surely those lifestyle factors have been influencing over time their genes. So if we started with my imaginary great granddad, imagine him as I said, somebody who didn't do any exercise, didn't take his nutrition seriously, working a lot and stressed out a lot, drinking alcohol, smoking, those things that over time, week in, week out, month in, month out, year in, year out, starts to affect how his genes are expressed. Then potentially that alters his genes in some way, which potentially then alters the genes of his offspring, aka my dad, and then he follows the same suit because he's copying the behaviors of his dad, and then my dad's kind of living his life in a similar way, and then I'm born and I'm looking up to my dad, who's looking up to his dad, and I'm copying the similar sort of behaviors, not doing a lot of exercise, eating poor diet, lots of processed food, not taking in nutritious, natural based foods. And that kind of keeps my genes expressed in that same way. But then therefore, is it possible if I decide, bang, no, I'm going to start exercising more. I'm going to start making sure that I drink less alcohol. I start taking on board, healthier foods, and I'm buying more natural foods as opposed to processed foods. If I start changing what I am doing over a period of time, can I therefore then start to undo what once had been done?
Yes, exactly. So if really we decided to have a kind of have a better lifestyle choices, such as like diet, exercise, enough sleep, less stress, and stop drinking too much, for example, alcohol or smoking and these kind of things. So obviously, yes, they can have an impact on our our genes, or they can have impact obviously on the expression of our genes. So yes, exactly. But obviously it should be very over a very long period of time. Obviously it can't be happen overnight. So regarding that case, I wanted to talk about a little bit about the same thing about the process of our aging as well. Because when you look at our chromosomes, at the end of each chromosomes, we have got all of the chromosomes, we have a repeated sequence, short repeated sequence, which is called telomere. And they are protecting the main aim we have got them. So because on a chromosome, they are protecting our chromosomes, and obviously because our DNA is located on the chromosome, so they are protecting the whole DNA. Because during our life, all of us are exposed with loads of mutations. Our genes are constantly mutating. So, but it doesn't mean it's not necessarily a bad thing, but these telomeres are going to protect us against all of these environmental factors like pollution, like radiation, these kind of things, chemicals. But as we age, because and our cells are dividing and dividing, so the length of our telomere is decreased a lot. So that is why this is the process of aging. We can't really do anything about it, because when we get that age of 85 or 90 years old, that is why some people can get loads of disease like cancer. At that point, that disease doesn't have any genetics background. There is nothing to do with genes. It's just the process of aging. And we get more diseases. For example, probably all of us have heard someone who was nearly 100 or 95 years old, even they can die with a simple cold, because they lost the telomere and the DNA cannot be protected anymore.
Right.
So our lifestyle choices from an early age, especially our diet, or for example, or as you mentioned, the amount of the alcohol we're drinking or smoking, these kind of things, because they impact a lot on length of our obviously telomere. And if we have a better choices, obviously we can protect our telomere, because the genes are expressing, obviously can protect our telomere obviously for a longer time as well. So it can impact. There was lots of studies and they showed that. So the lifestyle choices impact on our telomere, and we can have them obviously, and the length of the telomere is a natural process. It's getting smaller and smaller by cell division during our aging. But lifestyle choices can impact on telomere, obviously can protect them better, so we can age better, we can have a better quality in our life. So this is quite interesting, again, fact about aging and the relationship between our environment and our aging as well.
Yeah, excellent. I've read and listened to to other people talking about how I pronounce it as telomere. I was obviously pronouncing it incorrectly, maybe, and that the telomeres are almost this other geneticist described them like almost like the ends of the shoelace.
Exactly. Yes.
But what I wasn't quite sure of when he talks about the end of that shoelace is in the genetic sense. Is that at the end, the very end of the strand of the gene? Is that where that telomere is?
It's the end of the chromosome. Yes.
Chromosome, sorry, right. So it's the end of the chromosome, and what I believe that I've come across was that, as you were saying, that they can shrink or get longer, and we have what is our physical age, stamped by our date of birth. But I've heard people talk about how we can almost have a different biological age in respect to the health of our telomeres. So one could be 50 years of age, that's how old he's been on this planet. But this person has, never smoked, never, or, drinks very little alcohol, exercises 3 or 4 times a week, has excellent nutrition, and therefore his telomeres or her telomeres would therefore be longer, and then potentially that would show that their biological age is actually a bit younger. Is that true?
Kind of, yes. We have biological age, and so obviously our biological age is influenced a lot by our environmental factors. And so the telomeres, the main thing with telomere, obviously when babies are born, they have got quite long telomere and up to age of, 4 or 5 years old. And then gradually these telomere, because we go over so many cell division and we lost very small part of the chromosomes, obviously whenever goes through any type of cell division, that part of the telomere. So in terms of the length of telomere, we can, with better lifestyle choices, we cannot really, I think, we can't really make them longer or shorter, but we can protect them better. They can expose with less environmental factor, and so yes, and that is how they can, obviously we can get better protection against or other other environmental factor which we can't really, because we can control some environmental factor, but we don't have any control, for example, on air pollution or radiation, obviously. But as much as we can, when obviously we are responsible for example, for our diet, obviously exercise, stress, sleep. Each of them had a great impact on the process of our aging. So when we look at, for example, some studies from 30 years ago, and then you compare them regarding our, for example, lifestyle choices, how they impact on the process of our life and our aging. So probably by today, if you can compare them, we can see that obviously because people get, all of us had better information and better knowledge regarding our lifestyle choices. So by nowadays, people are trying to have a better choices and diet, obviously. And when you look at even how the people are aged, between, for example, if you compare for example, a woman is 45 years old now, and with the woman was 45 years old 30 years ago, the way they age, the whole body, even the wrinkles and everything they get, obviously nowadays there you can see a huge difference. We age better, we can get a better quality. It depends on obviously our choices. So yeah, it's kind of the protection for us, can protect us better against those environmental factors.
I see. And you mentioned just at the start of this thread of this kind of conversation about how the genes are constantly mutating. Are they mutating because they're a bit like the brain and neurons? The brain is constantly like pruning itself. I don't need these neurons anymore, so I'm going to get rid of them. but I need more of these. Is that how our genes are? Is that process kind of interlinked with what the genes are doing there? They're constantly trying to evolve to, I don't know, sift out parts of the gene or chromosomes that they don't need, so that it's only keeping the important ones in relation to the environment that we are living in. Is that what's...
A mutation means any random change in the sequence of DNA.
Yeah.
This is called mutation. And if you look at the loads of genes during the evolutionary period, some of them become, obviously, as you said, they were gradually over millions of years, might just lost. But it doesn't mean, but mutation means when any environmental factor, any factor can impact on mutation. And so it means that the sequence, this is the arrangement of the sequences on DNA. This is kind of a very random process, and that sequence is changed. And so sometimes, as I said, it's not a necessarily bad thing, because mutation is the main cause of variation. That's why we have got genetics variation, and we are not similar to each other. We are not similar to our even 100% to our parents or siblings, because we are the result of sexual reproduction. So all the living organisms are they are a result of the sexual reproduction. So they have lots of mutation and variation. So if there was no mutation, obviously there was no variation, there was no evolution, and all of us were like a bacteria, look like our ancestors like bacteria. So that is not necessarily a bad thing, it's a good thing, but very rare genetics disease are caused by mutation. And so that is a quite complicated process, because it depends. We have got genetic mutation, chromosomal mutations. They are a little bit different, but in a very simple way, when the sequence of the DNA sequences is randomly changed, that is called mutation.
Yeah. I'm just going off memory now from a long time ago. Something's going to my mind about the sequencing of the DNA. And I'm just remembering letters. Is it T, C?
Yes, exactly, those letters. Yes.
Is it just 3 or is it 4?
Yeah, there are 4 letters. It's very interesting, amazing. Yeah. These 4 letters is our body language. They are just making our. Obviously our DNA is made up of, because billions of nucleotides, which is made up of phosphate group, sugar group, and those for nitrogen, we call them bases, which is adenine, guanine, cytosine, and thymine. So yes, exactly. When we're talking about, because when we sequence our DNA, if you look at the sequence of your DNA, you will see loads of these letters, A, C, C, G, G. They have got these. You see these letters, and every 3 of those letters, they make a specific genetic code, which is responsible to make a specific protein in our body.
So, as you said, about the sequencing of those bases would, when they change, that is when the genes are mutating, it is the sequences of those 4 bases which are changing, and therefore they will change in response to the environment. Is that correct?
Yes.
So then, do you science have any idea how quickly then the body will start changing that sequence in response to the environment that it's experiencing? Like how quickly can the body just go, right, I'm going to change the order of the sequence because of this, I don't know, different toxin that's come into my body, for example? How quickly can that change occur?
Yeah, estimate exactly how quickly, but it takes quite a long time. For example, if someone is smoking, so obviously in maybe 10 years, maybe nothing happened to them. And then when they get older, like for example, around age of 75 or 65, it depends obviously how much cigarette they use every day. So they might get a heart attack, for example. So you can't really, it's like exactly like that. You can't, this is it takes quite long time. But mutation, the ones, for example, if you look at during our evolutionary period, what happened during the evolution, because obviously mutation was one of the main cause of evolution. This is how we evolved, because some genes they had a better adaptation to the environment, they survived. And so we had some characteristic over a period of time, and which we couldn't really adapt to the change of environment. So we gradually, it happens for a long time, maybe sometimes during evolutionary periods, over just 1 million years, maybe. So some of those characteristics is disappeared. So this is how we had extinction in some species, like for example dinosaurs, how they extinct. But nowadays, but when we're talking about specific, like the how environmental factors impact on our mutation, can they increase or decrease the rate of mutation? Yes, they can impact on it. But obviously it takes time. For example, if I stop smoking today, so it doesn't mean from tomorrow everything will be okay. So it takes quite a long time to recover from that.
And I guess an example I think of is a friend of mine, and I think this can link to sport quite well. I've got a friend of mine. When I first knew him, he was quite a slight guy, quite slim, really. Yet, if you was to come across him now, especially with his shirt off, he is a very muscly guy, very muscly. And if you bumped into him 20 years ago and then bumped into him today, 20 years ago, you would look at him and go, oh, he's just naturally a slim guy. And yet if you bumped into today, most people will go, he's naturally built that way. He's naturally a muscly guy. And how I see it, again, I don't know if this is true, but it's how I see it, that I have a rough idea what my friend did to change from being very slim to being the exact opposite of that. And that change came in a change in his environment. And that change in his environment was going to the gym 5 to 7 days a week and working out. Pretty much, he has been going to the gym 5 to 7 days a week for the last 12 years.
Wow.
And how I see it is that in the end, he's just kept going to the gym, going and going and going and going and going and going, and forced a change. In my opinion, most likely a genetic change. And I think for a lot of people who start going to the gym normally because they want to be healthier or they want their body to look differently, I think a lot of people go to the gym for a shortened period of time, months, maybe a year or two, and they don't see a huge amount of change, and then they stop. And my theory, it's just my own little independent theory, is that they stop before their body has got used to this change, change in environment. So they're not seeing a huge amount of progress, and then they stop and their body reverts back to what it was. Whereas I believe that my friend and other people that have done something similar, in the end, forced his body genetically beyond a threshold, which forced it to change. Because his family and not necessarily big muscly guys either. His brother's quite a slim guy, and yet, as I said, if anybody bumped into him now, most people would say or guess he's just naturally a muscly guy. Whereas, as I said, I think he has willed that, he has changed that through his physical environment and changing it.
Exactly. Yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. So it requires a lot of time your body to adapt to the new environmental changes. Obviously, height and weight are quite again complicated characteristic because they have some genetics factor determine them, as well as environment. So we can't exactly say that which one is stronger, but definitely environment has a great impact on weight and height, especially on weight. But as you said, yeah, I agree. So your body, obviously, when any changes is happening to our environment, so obviously we require a little bit time to adapt to those changes.
Yeah. So Greg Jowett, if you watch this podcast, there you go. This is what Dr. Marayam says. I'm right. You are right. And anybody else listening who watching this, who does want to change their body, who does want to get fitter, who does want to, change their body shape. A key to this is persistence over time. And most people quit way before, a significant threshold change. In my opinion, whether that is, and this is in both realms really, most people have got, having troubles in life in some way, but they're waiting. They wait. They will stick with these issues that they've got, the problems that they've got. But for those that do change, they reach a threshold, an emotional threshold, a mental threshold, is I just can't take this anymore and I'm going to change. And I feel like that is also the same in this example about my friend Greg Jowett and forcing his body, pushing it to a threshold where the genes went, right, now my body has to change. Because my other guess is that, I think a big part of our body and our genes is a lot of it will be to do with survival. It will evolve to survive in line with the environment. And for example, if the human body believes and gets to the point where it believes that I have to have more muscle, for example, in order to survive on this planet, then in the end, it will change and express certain genes to allow that to happen. Is my way of thinking correct or not?
Yeah, I think this is come back to our today's discussion, mainly the importance of genes on athletic performance. Obviously, yes. Again, in terms of sport, this is a very controversial very controversial discussion again when we talk about.
I love controversy.
I know whether genetics or epigenetics are important have a special, very essential role on athletic performance or not. So yes, so because again, sport or being athlete. Or our athletic performance, they are influenced by genetics and environment. Both of them are important. But as we were talking about environmental factors and our epigenetics factors, obviously environment, like diet choices, how much exercise we do every day. So all of them had a great impact on our performance as well. But always that is, I don't know, all of us during our life, probably we heard this phrase that practice makes everything perfect. So this is the question when it comes to sports. Some people asking, for example, if I go to the gym every day, if I do loads of sport, if I'm, for example, can I become a very famous, I don't know, football player, for example, in future? Mainly this is all teenagers maybe discuss this kind of discussion, and they think if they practice makes everything perfect. So if they do loads of put so much effort on their athletic performance, and so one day they can become a very famous athlete. That is very controversial. There is not very direct answer for this question really. But if you come back to the science, because nowadays, especially in recent years, there has been significant rise in the use of the DNA testing, because nowadays we can test the DNA and we look at specific genes determine, for example, our muscle strength, muscle power, or our aerobic capacity. So which they are determining our athletic performance, they are main factors. So therefore, it's really common nowadays. Even I was doing some research, and there are lots of companies, they do DNA testing, and especially they are specialized in sport field, and they do it for athletes, for example, coaches, or all sport teams. Some people, they get those DNA tests, especially when they are younger, and they look at those, and then they can train them better. This is how the main aim of those DNA testing to improve their physical abilities. So, but from science point of view, it's quite interesting to discuss whether how genes are determine our athletic, our physical or sporting ability. And so because each of us has an individual and unchangeable DNA structure. So, but that DNA structure, when we're talking about this DNA sequence, just affects us in very different way. Probably some of us very good. All of us have got different abilities. It's quite interesting when you think about it deeply. In terms of sport, some of us are very good, for example, in running or swimming. And or some of us are really unable, for example, to process gluten. We need to have a gluten-free diet. So same thing with other things. So that is related to genetics. Yes, the answer is yes, it is. But it's not all, again, as we discussed earlier, not all about our genes. Our environment, how, for example, if I am good at running at early age, someone, for example, find it out and put me in the right direction is important, obviously, as well. Our age is important as well. So even I am very good at running, at age of 45, I can't become a famous runner, obviously. So these are our environmental factor, which is really important as well. But when we understand the DNA better, obviously, it impacts on obviously how we can understanding of how, as an athlete, we can develop those physical abilities probably at earlier age and to become a successful athlete. So just I would like to talk about some of those genetic factors which is determine our physical abilities. Again, before just going to a little bit more details, just we know that in terms of when we're talking about the sport, so a lot of factors impact on it, like the size of body, our weight, our height, and these kind of things. Each of those characteristics, again, are determined by genes and environmental factor. So therefore, we can come into conclusion that gene plays very important role in determining our some of the characteristic which is strongly related to our athletic performance. One of these characteristics, which is really important because these are few characteristics, they are again has a great impact on our physical abilities, like our muscle contractions or the muscle strength, muscle power, and our aerobic capacity is really important as well. So are they genetics? Again, so recently, a lot of studies have been done. And so the answer is yes, there are some genes are determining our, for example, muscle strength. And because when we're talking about the muscle strength, we're talking about the ability of your muscles to generate enough forces, obviously, to be able to do your any type of sport you do. And we have, there are a few genes are involved determining our muscle power as well. And so yes, there is. So therefore, there are some genetics factor in terms of, especially because when we're talking about muscle is had a great impact on our athletic performance. And muscle is made up of lots of proteins and fibers. And so those genes, there is a genes which is called ACE genes. Which is that gene was determined, it was had a very great impact on specific proteins on muscle and fibers. And so it determined our muscle strength, for example. So yes, so therefore genetics, and also the same thing with our aerobic capacities. So is again, is definitely, yes, there are a few genes are involved and determining those capacities. That is why some people can do a specific, especially with running and or cycling, do it for a longer period. Some people might do it for 10 minutes and they get tired. So those two persons, they have got different aerobic capacity as well. So genetically, or for example, same thing with resistance and our ability to, I found that one very interesting. So resistance and our ability to recovery from any injury as well. This is really common thing. It's happened to all very professional athletes. So they get loads of injury during the career. And so, but people respond to those things differently. So which is, can be again genetic factor. So some of them recover, obviously, they had a better recovery period. Some of them require more time to recover. So the same thing with, because this is interesting as well. So when we take any medication for any reason, our body responds to that medication, which is as kind of new environmental factor, differently, because we have got different genes. The same thing for each person, everything, especially in terms of how their body response to them, or how the ability to recover from any type of injury is different as well. So this is again definitely genetics, but obviously we can't really separate genetic factor and environmental really factor, because when we're talking about the environmental factor, means this is kind of we are constantly interacting with our environment. All living organisms are like that. So these are, I thought, important factors which is impact on our athletic performance. But if you come back to the epigenetics factors, obviously is important again as well, because there are some epigenetics factor because these genes again constantly they are on and off. Yes. So exactly, yeah. If I want to be a successful athlete, if I don't have a good diet, obviously, even if I had a strong gene in terms of determining my muscle strength, very good muscle power, so obviously I can't really be very successful because I don't have a good diet, and that is again impact on my expressing on my genes. My body cannot respond to those environmental factors properly.
Yeah, that makes sense. So for example, somebody could be born with a gene which gives them the ability to have high aerobic capacity, but therefore, if, for example, over a 5, 6, 7, 8 year period, that athlete's diet is very unhealthy, and they're not eating the right foods, that could force that gene to get this gene for aerobic capacity to change or turn off. Sorry.
Exactly, yes, because it's important as the amount of the protein we get or carbohydrate is impact on our muscle contractions or the muscle structure. So that is why it's really important for us, the epigenetics factor. Or for example, even if I do a DNA test and it's telling me my test is, for example, I have a genes which is responsible for my aerobic capacity or my muscle power again, and then if I don't really do any exercise during the day, again, it doesn't really, it means my body is not ready to become a, athlete. So that's why I'm saying the environmental factor is important again. So you can't really, we never ever can separate them from each other, the genetics and environment. So both factors play an essential role.
Yeah. So you mentioned obviously that there are genes that are responsible for strength and power, which will obviously therefore have an impact on speed. And you mentioned that that there's a gene that's responsible for cardiovascular aerobic capacity.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Is there or could there be a gene there for coordination? How coordinated?
Oh, that is a really, yes, it is. Very good question. So it has been scientists, they have been found nearly 200 genetic variants which are determining our athletic performance. And definitely, yes, there is for coordination. I think the most of them are. So the loads of genes are responsible for the coordination and how your nervous system is obviously a response to those changes as well. Yes, that is, there are loads of, again, genes determining the coordination.
Because for me, the thing about coordination, a while ago, going back 20 years or so ago, that was where I would feel that people would use the argument when they talk about a talented athlete, a very talented one, where they would say that there wasn't influence over coordination, if you like. They're born with these great levels of coordination to be able to do these things, and I didn't believe that. And another one would be, take the example of Usain Bolt. He was just born with the ability to sprint fast, and again, I'm not doubting that he wasn't born with some advantages, but I think you take Usain Bolt out of Jamaica and plonk him somewhere else, what he went on to do does not happen. Bear in mind, Jamaica, their main sport is athletics, is sprinting. That's the sport that everybody on the island is wanting to do. So even though he was born with these, he would have had some genetic advantages. The environment that he was in, culturally and also in a sporting context, that still must have, in my opinion, shaped his ability to get to the level that he got to. Would you say, where would you sit with what I've said there?
Yes, because exactly the same in sport is the same as very similar to intelligence. When we're talking about the intelligence, most people think that if someone is born from a quite intelligent family, but again, it depends how do you define really intelligence is really controversial again, because there is a huge difference between psychologists and biologists are not in agreement with how we define the intelligence. But there are some genes are obviously not, they are quite very complicated characteristic. The same as athletic performance is a very, very complicated characteristic as well. So because not only one gene, there are loads of genes are determining these characteristics.
Yeah.
But the environment, as you mentioned, has a great, great impact on obviously on how these genes are expressed and how your body, because this is important, how our body responds to those changes as well. And also we shouldn't underestimate our adaptation as well, because your body needs to adapt to those changes, obviously, and require time. For example, from day one, we can't go and run for kilometers or cycling for a long time. Obviously, you need to do it every day. You need to be very determine, and you started, for example, I don't know, from 20 minutes first, and then 30, and then 40 gradually, and then your body can adopt those. This is how our body adopting the environmental change and how you interact with the environment, which is really, really important.
Yeah. You know, that obviously does play a big part with athletes who, you know, who sometimes can maybe overdo their training. You know, they're not giving their body enough adaptation time. You know, if you keep overloading, you know, how I look at physical exercise in this books, I think there's two forms of stress. I think there's mental stress, you know, overthinking, you know, the problems in our mind going over and over and over. And then there's physical stress. And exercise, going to the gym, is physical stress to our muscle. You know, it's just, there's this stress on there, you know, on this muscle. However, like with mental stress, I believe, you know, psychologically, there's this term, this elastic load. There's a certain tolerance amount of mental stress that we can handle. And when we go beyond that, it becomes too much, and people will then start to struggle with certain mental health issues, whether that be depression or anxiety in bouts of it, or whether that is physical stress, as I said, from going to the gym, or an athlete doing their regimented training. But if they are doing too much and not giving their body the time to rest and adapt, and you keep doing more and more and more, then that then can have a negative impact on performance. And a previous guest that I had on the show, an Olympic gold medalist called Matt Langridge, he spoke about how he went to 4 Olympics, and his first Olympics, they didn't get a medal. Then he got a silver, and then he got another silver, actually. And he was on the verge of quitting and not going for the to the 4th Olympics. And one of the things that he did change was how hard he was training. You know, he almost went against what the coaches were telling him to do, and what the environment he was in was telling him to do, which was, you turn up every day and you go at it 100% every session all the time. And he felt that he was getting to the Olympics and then being burnt out. And when he decided to kind of just listen to his own mind and body, he was then smart enough to select when he could go full throttle at the gym and really give it 10 out of 10, and when he needed to listen to his body and either rest completely or go easier. And I think that will, I'd imagine, kind of fit in with this adaptation, that if you just keep putting the foot down full throttle, the body gets overloaded, overstressed, which somehow potentially impacts on the adaptation of the muscle, of the genes in some way. I'm not only guessing at that bit, really.
And also, I think, especially in athletic performance, is very strongly depends on their mental capacity as well, because everyone has got different, obviously, mental capacity. Again, I was just reading a paper a few days ago regarding that case, and it said it's linked to a little bit to genetics as well, obviously, but environment important as well. Some people have more, obviously, mental capacity when they are under stress, and so they can bear more stress. So yeah, that is again is an important factor. We should really consider that factor as well.
Yeah. What about genetics and mental health? And for example, genetics and depression. I've heard in the past people talk about depression potentially being genetic. Where do you stand with that?
Yeah, I'm not very expert in mental health, but in terms of the genetic point of view, there are some genetic issue which there are some obviously mental health issue which they have got a strong genetics link, like for example schizophrenia is a genetic disease. So if it runs in the family, obviously there is more likely obviously the children, at least the children get that disease. But in terms of depression, because I'm not a psychologist, but we know the different types. We have got different types of depression. So manic depression has got kind of a genetics link, but again, environment had a very, very great impact on it as well. But yes, there are, but it's a very complicated trait, because it's not only one gene is involved. There are several genes are involved in this issue.
But I would like, how I would choose to look at it, though, is, as you said, there are some genetic markers, some genes, that influence mental health, and in this example, depression. But there is still always this factor of epigenetics and our environment, and that therefore it is that even if there is a family history of multiple generations of depression, there is still, in my opinion, the power to influence that by changing certain environmental factors. I don't know if you was to look at if you was to look at 100 people who struggled with quite severe depression, and then you analysed, right, well, how much physical activity are all those 100 people doing? What's their diet and nutrition like? Where do they live? These types of things. How much alcohol are they drinking? How much drugs are they taking, if at all? How much smoking are they doing? And I wonder if, people who, I'm not saying I know this, I'm just guessing here, if people who are struggling with depression, there's a high percentage of them that are ticking off some of those negative lifestyle factors that I just listed there, and that by then doing the opposite of that, you start doing more exercise, you take control of your nutrition, you cut down your alcohol, you stop smoking, you start forcing yourself out into social situations, and joining a sports club, which has multiple benefits. By then flipping the direction of what you are doing over time, could start switching on the genes which turn those genes for depression or linked to depression off. This is how I would look at it. Whether that's true or not, that's how I see it, or I would choose to see it.
Yeah, I think you mean the environmental factor can express those, they can impact on the level of how those genes are expressed, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and just I need to add, yeah, exactly, because when we're talking about depression, as I said, I'm not a neuroscientist or psychologist, and I shouldn't really, but I know, because I'm talking about the genetics point of view. It depends, because we have got so many, as I said, type of depression, but manic depression or bipolar, for example, they are related, they have some genetics link, but as you mentioned, that environmental factor, as you said, they impact on express of those genes, because we know that the main reason for having manic depression is kind of some chemicals and hormones are not in balance in our brain. So we express, so that person who is in a very manic depression or severe depression it's not necessary they have a specific reason for that. They don't know why they have this feeling, because of these chemical imbalances in their brain. Some of the hormones, how some of the hormones are expressed, probably, for example, in most cases, for example, the hormones which is responsible for the happiness, for example, is not expressed enough. So that is why, so they get those feeling and manic depression. But when as you said, we look at the environment, and this is I think the amount of the support they get, where they live, this is really important as well. And obviously physical activity or diet. But unfortunately, the problem is most people with manic depression, they can't really follow very good, life, the routines as the exercise or diet probably. But when they are in an environment which they can get more support and help, probably it's easier for them to come back to their routine. And those, again, changes like diet and exercise can impact on those, obviously the expression of those genes, and they can have a better control. So I don't know, but again, but I've read a book recently. I think it was called The Power of Pain. They were talking about how the mental, these medications for depression or any type of mental health issue has a good impact, and can obviously treat this issue or whether or not. And then the writer came into this conclusion. This is mainly none of the medication, honestly, are working. They work for a short period of time, and but they considered environmental factor can have a much better impact on taking the medication, especially for depression, because the people are on medication and they can't, again, it depends on type of medication, but can cause, like, they can't socialize much with people, is impact on the sexual relationship as well. So kind of, because they had other impact on their life, automatically they become very isolated, they feel lonely, and again they get those feelings as well again. So that is why this is the importance of epigenetics, again, even in mental health. So is really, really important.
You mentioned at the start of this line of conversation on depression and mental health about the genes which could influence the release of certain neurochemicals and hormones. And I've read, a few articles and sections in books about, antidepressants, for example, and how I think a number of them are basically trying to boost one's levels and amounts of serotonin, the happy neurochemical. And even though, but there has been things written about how there's been no proof that just that one chemical, that is the one thing that is going to fix this person's depression. And, giving them this tablet, which, has potentially this link, this tablet which is releasing and putting more serotonin in the body and therefore the brain, that is this cure to it. And, from what I have read, there's serious questions about that, and about the impact that is having. And, I think one way of looking at it, if they were working, then the mental health issues will be going down. And, the number of prescriptions being given for these types of things in the last 20, 30 years has just gone up. So if the medication was working, then the mental health and depression would be going down. But it's only going up. So, and I would imagine that something like serotonin, like with most things, it has more than one function. More than one neurochemical.
Exactly.
Have an impact over how somebody feels. It's never just going to be one chemical, one hormone. It's going to be like a potion, a concoction of all these different things.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, exactly. Because I think it was a few months ago, a new study was released, a new paper, and they were discussing whether there is a serotonin or other chemicals are involved, or the combination of few hormones, and which they came to this conclusion definitely is not one chemical is involved in depression. There are more. And that is why the medication, after it doesn't work for a long time, because definitely is not only one hormone.
Yeah.
Mental health is very complicated, again, to talk about.
Again, it's how I, I have chosen to do lots of research in lots of different areas and listen and read to the work of professionals like yourselves, of people who are writing about that stuff because of these types of things, because a lot of this information, even just on epigenetics, for example, doesn't get out to the people. Most people, epigenetics, this term and this process of epigenetics has now been, widely known for at least 15 years, more than that, hasn't it? But the average Joe person will know nothing about it, and it takes time, and it's also, impacted by media. What the media decide to run a story on, what the Daily Mail decides to put in their articles about mental health and genes and things like that. If the BBC ran a story about epigenetics or ran a story about, antidepressants not really impacting on depression, for example, then that is more likely to be accepted. But they don't run stories like that. So this information only trickles out slowly. And therefore it's not getting to people. And I think if people can understand, as I said, this basic premise of epigenetics, what it does for me is about self-empowerment. I am responsible. I am responsible for how my body, my brain, how it turns out. That's how I choose to see it. That's how I, the work that I do, the reading that I do, the research that I do, that's why I do read it, because I want to understand it more. And if I understand it more and I have more knowledge, that backs up my confidence in that, yeah, if I exercise regularly, if I have a good diet, if I do things that make me feel happy, if I take on challenges, if I keep myself in social settings, meeting new people just like you, doing things like this, I'm in control of that, and that's affecting how healthily I'm living my life, which then goes back to what you were saying at the start about the telomeres, that we can take control of many environmental factors which are impacting on how our genes are expressing themselves. So for me, epigenetics, if more and more people truly understood it, they would become empowered to feel that they're not at the mercy of this life that has been given to them, or this situation that they're in, that people out there can do action and take actionable steps to change their life.
Exactly, yes. As you said, I really like this, what you mentioned, that responsibility is important, and we need to be responsible for us, and also how we look after ourselves, and also this is how and how we give that kind of information to the public, and this is how the science communication, right? Because that's what I'm really fascinated with, science communication. This is my passion, because we can talk about very complicated science, because science is quite, if you read a very a science paper from one of those, for example, Nature journal, so obviously it's really complicated, so not everyone can understand it, but this is our responsibility to simplify all of them, and then give that correct information to the public. And so that is the importance of the work you're doing. So this is kind of a science communication.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. As I said, the more simpler, the research which is being done by yourselves and other people in your field, the more simpler we can make it, and then the more we can get it out there. That's what's going to help culture change, society change. Some people, unfortunately, just don't want to take the time, which I can find annoying. I as I was saying, I 100% believe I'm responsible for everything, for the vast majority, not everything, there's always going to be things in life you're not going to control. But I like to look at life in terms of what I can control. I can control what I believe for a start. I can control how much exercise I do. I can control how often I meet up with my friends or communicate with people. I can control what nutrition I take. I can control how much time I spend on social media, wasting time, looking at everybody else's so-called perfect lives. I can control many, many things, but people kind of give their power away to various things, like social media, for example, which has been designed to, in my opinion, manipulate people in certain ways, and that isn't actually helping people's mental health. There's a lot of links between, for example, social media and poor mental health.
Yes.
But I'm choosing to use social media, like with this, for good. If you're going to waste some time, watch it and listen to a podcast which has got some information in there which can actually help you take your life in a new direction in some way, instead of just using it watching Love Island or whatever else is on TV these days, that type of stuff. Educate yourself. It's everyone's responsibility to educate themselves outside of that box that they got educated in at school and even at university. I've learned far more since leaving university than I did when I was there. I've learned more outside of education than when I was in it. And that was a choice that I just wanted to understand. I want to understand more and more, because that gives me the ability to control my life more.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and knowledge is power. So this is really important, and we should never ever forget that. And so, as you said, educating yourself, it allows you to have a better lifestyle. And also, in terms of anything to do with the health, so is really important nowadays. We educate ourselves and finding right. This is really important. Right sources, because nowadays, because of the social media, internet, you get loads of information. Sometimes we bombed with loads of information, and but not all of them are. Everything on internet not is obviously is correct. Doesn't give us the correct and accurate information, especially regarding health. And unfortunately, on the other hand, there are loads of commercialized things as well, in terms of, again, health and specifically nutrition. If we get more information and educate ourselves, and obviously we never ever go through those very commercialized products, which they don't really, some of them even don't have can damage our body, can have a negative impact on us. This is so important. And I always tell my students, knowledge is power. So we need to educate ourselves as much as we can.
Definitely. And I'd like to add to that about knowledge is power. Many people actually some people gain the knowledge, but then they don't take action. Applying the knowledge is key. Most people know that they need to exercise, but don't. Most people know what healthy food is, but they don't eat it, if you know what I mean. So you've got to put the wheels in motion and do with the knowledge. You've got to then use the knowledge and take actionable steps. That's going to, as we're talking about here, ultimately have a positive impact on the expression of your own genes, which is ultimately going to affect your health and how well you live your life. Because one of my crazy goals I set myself, believe it or not, first of all, I've set myself a goal to live beyond 100 years of age. And within that, I've set myself this task of, there's a race that is run for 100-year-old people, and it's the 100-meter sprint. And I've set myself a challenge nearly 20 years ago, about 18 years ago, that when I am 100, the year that I turn 100, I'm going to run a 100-meter race, and I want to break the world record. And part of the reason that I want to do that is to prove that age isn't the barrier that people think that it is, and that you can take control of your life. Because the only way that I am going to get to that race, I've got to give myself a chance to get there. I actually survived long enough to get there, and I've got to be healthy mentally, spiritually, emotionally, and physically. And I've also got to keep training. I've got to keep exercising. You know, if I stop doing those basic fundamentals, I won't even turn 100. I won't even get to that point. And then, if I don't exercise, if I don't continue to exercise for the next 60 years, I'm not gonna be fit enough to do it. And there's a guy that I once briefly worked with. He was over 80 years of age, and I ended up playing table tennis with him. He was called Les Darcy, and this man, old man with his cap on, at 80 years of age, whooped my backside at a game of table tennis. I was like, what the heck is going on here? How's this old man beating me, you know, easily without even trying? And in the end, he confessed that he was the world champion at table tennis. And he also said, I don't just play table tennis, and I'm not just a world champion at table tennis, I'm also a world champion at powerlifting. And he was a world champion at the clean and jerk powerlifting. And that was at 80 years of age. And it blew my mind that this guy at 80 was living his life like that. And this moment interacting with him, and I met him a few times after that, massively influenced me to believe that if you stop doing, you know, and that was one of the questions, if you stop exercising, it's very hard to get back on the bike. And that was one of the things he said. I said, how have you done it? He said, I just never stopped. I never stopped doing these things. I never stopped doing it. And my intention is to never stop, because I want that race and I want that record.
Perfect. Yeah.
So there's just one thing I wanted to go back on, which we kind of when we was talking about sports and genes, and I just wanted to touch back on this, which was the impact of age on performance, for example. And from a lot of the research that I was doing, you know, 18, 19 years or so, that sort of period, I was trying to find out and discover as much as I possibly could about some of the world's greatest athletes. And one of the ways that I was doing that was reading their autobiographies. I would read lots and lots of different great athletes' autobiographies. And I wanted to understand how did they do it? What were they doing? What was this person's life that enabled Tiger Woods to go and do what he did, what John McEnroe did, what Bobby Charlton did, what Tiger Woods did, what Johnny Wilkinson did, what Michael Jordan did, Michael Johnson. What did all these athletes? What were they doing? How did they get to where they got? And what could I find out through reading their autobiographies? And one of the things that kept coming up was how early they started doing what they did. Mm-hmm. And a prime example of that, which demonstrates this, was with Tiger Woods. His dad put a golf club in his hand at the age of 3. And Tiger Woods was practicing playing golf from the age of 3 onwards. And I believe that the age that you start to do something, is massively impacting how easily, when we're younger, we are a lot more malleable with what we can do. For example, children can learn languages easier when they're much younger. And I believe it's the same thing with learning skills and techniques, that because the first 7 years of life is critical for the development of the brain and body. And the brain is almost in a hypnotic-like state for the first 7 years of life. Hence why children, for the first 7 years, they can, the way that they play is in a way which they convince themselves that what they're doing is real. You know, they can pick up an imaginary cup of tea and pretend to be drinking it, or picking up a twig and really believing that that is a gun, because their brain waves are operating in a trance-like state, which enables them to see the world and operate in the world differently. That their conscious faculties are not turned on yet. That the activation and development of the prefrontal cortex doesn't start to come in properly until they get beyond the age of 7. And my theory is that what you learn in, let's take it in a sports context, in those first 7 years of life, if you start learning skills and how to perform in a sport in those first 7 years, that then those skills, those techniques get locked in. They get locked in into the subconscious mind, which then makes it easier for them to replicate it as they get older. But I'm also curious to wonder if that is also how much of an impact that is having genetically, you know, at that young age. I wonder if perhaps, you know, are the genes more malleable, manipulable in those early years of life? Is there that possibility, do you think, Marayam?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part regarding the genes? So what did you ask?
So I was wondering, as I was saying about the mind it's more malleable. It can learn new things in those first 7 years of life a lot easier. And I was wondering if, obviously, when and if a child starts learning a sport at the age of 4, 5, 6, even at that early age, could that potentially have a stronger impact on the expression of genes at that stage of life compared to learning a skill at an older age, say 30 or 20?
Yeah. I think yes, there is, because again, when we're talking about age was one of those environmental factor which we talk about it. So especially when we talk about sport, I think obviously if the child has got if they do lots of, as you said, from the early age started to do lots of exercise, so they had. So these, again, they had a great impact on their gene expression. It can be, but the problem is with the age, I don't think so. For example, if you compare someone who is 7 years old and then 30 years old, if I am at 30 years old, decided to improve my abilities to become a good swimmer, I might learn swimming, I might be, but I can't be a professional, obviously, athletes, because as we know in sport field, age is a very important factor. So yeah, as we are younger, so obviously it's much easier to improve your physical abilities. And yes, but I hope I understood your question. But I think your question was, by getting age, the level of the gene expression is decreased. Am I right?
Yeah, I was just wondering, when you're much younger, let's say a 5-year-old, for example, I wonder if the learning of skills and being physically active, are those genes be able to be influenced more easily as a 5-year-old versus a 30-year-old, for example? Can those genes be easier to be expressed, turned on or off more easily as a 5-year-old than a 30-year-old?
Oh, I don't think so. Age, obviously, we have aging, the process of aging, yes. The aging can be important factor on those abilities, but not necessarily as impact on gene expression.
Right. That's fine. Yeah, it was just a line of inquiry that I was curious to ask you about. I think we're getting towards the end of the conversation here now, Marayam, and I just wanted to, thank you for coming on and giving up your time and really giving some invaluable information to anybody and those who go on to listen to this. And I think what I would like, I don't know about yourself, I will ask you this, but I think what I would like to get across to people who listen to this is that, we do have the power to influence ourselves. That this is what I believe epigenetics demonstrates, that we don't have to be a victim, if you like, to our genes, a victim to our past families' hereditary issues. And I think this is what epigenetics demonstrates. I was wondering if there's a final thought, a final thing that you would like to, put across about, what you've learned and the things that we've spoken about today.
Yeah. So just I want to put stress on the impact of epigenetics. As we talked at the beginning of our discussion, so definitely genes are not really determining our destiny. So our epigenetics factor can have a great impact. The environmental factor had a great impact on how our genes are expressed. And so therefore it helps us to have a better lifestyle and also a better quality of life. And also it helps us in the process of our aging. We can have a higher quality, which is, I think, is the most important thing. So therefore, the environmental factor, when we discuss that nature versus nurture, we can't really separate them from each other. So this is because our genes are interacting with the environment, and which is really, really important factor. And I want to add something else. Several times I want to correct ourselves. Several times we talk about, for example, there is genes for depression or genes for any specific issue. So scientifically, we can't say that we have a genes for depression or we have a genes for cancer. It's not really 100% correct. So what we have, there are the mutations, obviously, which is when the genes are mutated, these kind of issues are happening, but we don't have any specific genes for anything, just any mutation. When we're talking about how we can get specific genetic disease, this is all about the mutation and how the genes are mutated. And thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you and regarding this interesting topic.
Yes, me too. I've thoroughly enjoyed this. As I say, this whole debate of nature versus nurture has been a line of inquiry that I've seriously looked into and been fascinated about in terms of sports performance for a long time. And I think, as I said earlier, for me, epigenetics for me fights the corner of the environment, playing a far bigger role, at least, than what was once the first thought of. And I think that is enough for somebody, for people to, as I said, to give them hope to turn their life around, whether that is in a sporting context or just generally, that all of us, athlete or non-athletes, can take control over certain lifestyle factors, which can then ultimately impact on the expression of our genes and therefore the impact of our health. So, as I said, Marayam, I'd just like to thank you again for coming on the show and giving up your time. I'm sure there's going to be, a huge amount of insightful knowledge for those who listen to this. So thanks again. It's been a real pleasure meeting you and discussing these topics with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rob. It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, it's a tough act to follow, but he's done it again.
excellence can be created, it can be replicated, it can be taught.